Looks like we have one person on the
meeting is being recorded.
Oh wow, very formal, thank you. I think it would be great just to go around, make sure everyone knows each other in person and on the phone. And then we'll go through kind of what today's gonna look like, and I'll pass it off to Ellie, who's gonna present today. So if we wanna get started, we don't have a huge group, but most people know each other, but if we just wanna say name, organization, and then how about if you have one extra hour to add to the day, how would you use it? That's your icebreaker for the day. Because lately I feel like I don't have enough time, which I'm sure a lot of people feel like. So, my name's Maddie. I am the chair of Work Group 1. I am with the American Heart Association, and if I had one more hour to add to the day, I would probably do yoga every day, because I say I'm going to do it, and I always feel better when I do it, but I don't know. It's not a daily activity, so there we go. John, would you like to go next? And just a reminder so that on the phone everyone can hear us, and the recording, if you guys can turn your mics on every time you talk.
I'm John Rosa from the Colorado Department of Human Services, and if I had an extra hour, I would either read more or go to the gym more.
Cool.
My name is Shannon. I work with Denver Urban Gardens, and if I had an extra hour, actually I'd either read or work out. I don't know.
I'm Ellie Agar with Hunger Free Colorado, and I also think I would work out, but with that I would need the energy to do that with extra hour.
My name is Sarah Rosberg, and I'm with Hunger Free Colorado, and I would read if I had an extra hour.
Oh yeah, let's go on the phone.
I'm Peter Mineta. I'm with the Colorado Association of Local Public Health Officials. And with my extra hour, I think I'd try to use it to plan out how to get even more time out of the day and what to cut out.
I like that, very strategic.
Hi, Abigail Kessner with CDPHE, and if I had an extra hour in the day, probably a tie between sleeping and reading.
Vinny Cervantes, Denver Alliance for Street Health Response, and I would definitely sleep.
I'm Erin Ulrich with the Blueprint to End Hunger, and if I didn't sleep enough, I would add sleep, but sleep is like my non-negotiable. So I would play soccer every day.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Kelly Wagner with the Piton Foundation, and like Abigail, I sleep or read.
Hi, my name is Andrew Stricker. I'm with Trailhead, and who am I kidding? I'd run around chasing my son.
Hi, Leslie Scotland Stewart with Project Angel Heart, and it's a tie between getting a massage and watching season 3 of Stranger Things.
Oh.
Maybe at the same time.
Oh, you can put TV under.
Boom. All of it.
Oh, love it.
My name is Stephanie Salazar Rodriguez, and I'm with the Mile High Alpha Alliance, and I would pre-plan healthier meals.
Oh, I was thinking that.
I'm Austin with Consumption Literacy Project, and I should sleep. But I would probably sit still or paint, and I'm a horrible artist, but I love the feeling of it.
No such thing as a terrible artist. Yeah, oh, and we have one more. Tawana, do you want to say hi and answer, if you had one more hour in the day, how would you use it?
Oh, one more hour in, I'm Tawana Henderson from Beyond the Classroom. And if I had one more hour in the day, I don't know, I think I would do something creative with it.
Okay, cool. Awesome, well thanks. Thanks for joining us. So just to give you guys a little heads up of what we're gonna be doing today, at our last meeting we talked a lot about some of the audiences that we could be looking at to address our long-term plan and our long-term campaign to really educate people about hunger, the impacts of hunger, and how it impacts people, regardless if they're experiencing hunger or not. And I think we all kind of agreed that we need to come to the answer of what's our baseline and what are we really trying to change and what audience are we trying to change before we can move forward with any details of our campaign. So today, we're going to start by having Ellie Agar present from Hunger Free Colorado as some of the data utilized in the blueprint to identify that where we are right now in this stage of people not really being aware of what hunger is was pulled from the from Hunger Free Colorado's voter poll. There are a few other sources, but mainly from the voter poll. And we know that this poll has a lot of great information. So what I've asked Ellie to do today is tell us a little bit about the poll, the questions that we know are going to be asked, and maybe some of the questions that could be asked, or maybe that have been asked in the past, but that we didn't necessarily see the data for specifically in the blueprint because you can't include all of it there. And I want you guys to think about, as we're looking through this, what other questions do we want information about? So whether that's going to be adding questions to the blueprint or whether that's going to be, we need to find this data somewhere else. I just want you to keep that in mind as we're talking through this, so that just for a frame as to why we're hearing this information. The other thing that I've asked her to talk a little bit about is, like, what does the poll look like? Like, what does the actual pollee, is that what it would be? The person answering the poll, what do they experience? What types of questions are they? How are they actually getting this poll? What does the people look like demographics, geographics, that kind of thing? So as you guys are listening to this as well, making sure we're thinking about, are we getting data from the people we need it from, or like what other data would we need? Again, other types of people, other locations, other stakeholders. So just keeping these questions in the back of your mind, because after Ellie presents, we're going to break up into small groups and answer some questions, helping us to figure out our next steps to getting there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellie.
All right, thank you.
Ellie, can you turn on your mic?
Oh, yes. Let me bring that a little closer. And I saw it up for a second there, so I know that.
I'm working on it.
Technology, actually.
I know. I thought we had it. So Hunger Free Colorado, we do a voter poll every 3 years. And 2 of them have actually taken place within a week or 2 of a presidential election. So it's been really interesting to see the voter polls around that time because we always do them in November. So 2010 was our first poll, then 2013, 16, and now we'll have one in 19. So they're really here to gauge perceptions in support of hunger issues and solutions. And so that can vary from poll to poll, but we're looking, since it is a voter poll, we're hoping to have a good idea of how Colorado is going to respond to various messaging, policy initiatives, things that might be coming either at the state or the federal level. You can go to the next. So this is just a little bit of the history of what we've looked at in the past. That very first year, a lot of our testing and messaging was around the application length. As you know, we shortened that from 26 pages. We also had questions around addressing child hunger and support of that, and just taking action in general around engaging in things that would alleviate hunger or just getting involved in their community. 2013, we were able to now start to retest a lot of our messages, a lot of our questions, to find kind of comparison across time. But we also, that's the year where we tested the food stamps versus SNAP, finding out that in our 2013 poll, there was much more receptivity to increasing benefits or maintaining them, to expanding services, all of that when we would reference it as food stamps versus SNAP. So you will see that we've used that a lot in our materials. We are hoping to kind of retest that. We also looked at people's understanding and support of dollars per meal in terms of this average SNAP benefit. their perception of how much they thought the program made up of the federal budget, and then what role having choices or control made, so choosing between food and rent or medication and food. And when we laid out those type of choices and control, people were much more supportive of programs that would alleviate hunger. So we can go to the next. And then our last goal, 2016, I'll be sharing a lot of what we got out of that last one in the rest of this presentation. But again, there we were focused in on food pantries. As you know, we passed some money through the state budget for food pantries to connect directly with Colorado farmers and producers, get Colorado proud items. So we were calling to find out if there would be support for that among Colorado. We were also looking at the type of food restrictions we thought might be coming down in terms of what people could purchase with their SNAP benefits, and how people were going to be responsive to maybe potentially harmful legislation that we hadn't seen yet, but we expected to be coming. So that's really the way that we've used this poll. As you can see, year over year, it's been 400 telephone interviews. That is the way it's conducted. And it is with registered voters. So it's based off of the voter list in Colorado. We use cell phones as well as landlines. You can see margin of error and confidence interval there. And we do a lot of A/B testing as well, because we want to know, is one phrasing, messaging idea more effective than another?
Can I ask a quick question before you move on?
Yes.
Was this conducted exclusively in English?
This is conducted exclusively in English. So we actually have had that conversation, and it's something we're looking at going forward. Given that it's a voter poll, we looked at how many monolingual Spanish speakers, which would be our alternative language, are registered to vote, and it was such a small percentage in terms of the amount that we're able to poll that essentially was cost prohibitive to do it in Spanish and English. So it is something that we're well aware of, and we've been looking.
Being aware of it and doing something about it is two different things.
Yeah.
Because there's significant people. There's more now than there. I don't know when you got your numbers, but even in the neighborhoods that I work, there's a significant number more now within the last couple of years of Spanish-speaking individuals that are registered voters. So, I mean, you said that you looked at it. What are next steps to try to remedy that?
So we've actually asked this year for our the company that we use for our polling. I've asked them to give me a quote to do it in Spanish. So I actually am getting those numbers because it's something that we'd like to do if it's feasible. And honestly, it does come down somewhat to finances and how far we can reach, but it's that was probably one of the biggest gaps we saw, especially looking at the poll this year. If we couldn't do it in Spanish, is that we've done a lot more outreach to those communities. We want to engage those communities. We know there's a lot of fear and a lot of additional attention on those communities this year. So I don't have those numbers back yet, but it is something that we're actively looking at.
I have a quick would there be a way to partner with some of the organizations that are represented at the table to do that, where it would be, it would be partnerships to get that to happen, bring costs down maybe?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I'm always open to talking about how we can make it happen. So as it stands, and again, we're talking about 2016 and kind of who we polled at that point and in the prior ones. You can see kind of the breakdown across political party. This is pretty representative of Colorado. I had pulled the voter party status in 2016, and independents were about 35%, and Republican and Democrats were about tied at 31.5%. So you will see that we do have slightly more, when we look at our demographic information, more Caucasian, older, conservative. And you can see that as a negative of, oh my gosh, we're only getting old white individuals, but anyways. But on the flip side, because we do use this as an advocacy tool, we want this to be something where we can go to our legislative body and say, your supporters and the people who are voting for you also support these hunger issues. Having this data and being able to point to some of those more conservative congressional districts and show support has actually been very helpful. So we've been able to really utilize that to be a better advocacy tool. But as we said, so one of the things that isn't represented here are monolingual households. We also, it is of registered voters, so obviously that depends on who is on those voter lists. And then the other thing would be areas of the state like rural Colorado is another focus for us. And they are definitely represented, but as a set number of individuals, when you have 400 interviews, most of those, being based on population, when you look at how many individuals were truly polled in some of these rural areas, you're going to see a much smaller number. So that's another thing that, depending on cost, we could oversample rural communities or Western Slope or things like that. So,
Hey, Ellie,
yeah.
so you say you have 400 and you split it up about 30, 30, 30. Are you identifying people before you know, do you randomly select people, or how do you make sure that you're getting a varied response? How do you pick people, I guess?
So the great thing is Hunger Free Colorado doesn't have to do that. We live as professionals. So the company that we hire does all of the, they get the list, they do the polling, they make sure that it's statistically representative and significant to the voter list in Colorado.
Okay.
So I can't tell you how or when they're identified. I just know that they do it so that we're getting the right representation of the state and of the voter list.
Okay.
So is the reason that rural is missing, do you know if it's because?
So it's not missing,
Okay.
but so if you think about, let's say, I don't actually know the percentage. Let's say 70% of Colorado lives in metro areas. It might even be higher. That means 70% of our respondents are probably also in metro areas.
Okay.
So that remaining, let's say 100 people or more are spread out across the state. That's what I'm saying.
That's helpful, thanks.
Okay. Let's see. So these are some of the consistent things that we pull on every year. So one is voters' top issues. This is open-ended, it's multiple choice, so they can, list all the things they feel are most pressing in our state. We also will look at perceptions of those who are struggling with hunger. So we're asking about what percentage of Colorado do you feel are struggling to get by or facing hunger, the way that it's phrased. And so they'll say, oh, less than 9% or 10 to 19 or 20 to 29. And they kind of break it down. And then we'll ask about how many in your local community and have the same phrasing, same question. We do often see that they will rate higher when they're talking about the state of Colorado than they do in their own community.
Oh, weird.
How are you doing? Oh. The people on the phone should still be able to see
Oh,
the
okay.
presentation. I know that doesn't help the people in the room.
When it comes to over here.
The other thing we pull on is their perception of the importance of hunger as an issue relative to other things facing the state. So we'll find out how important they feel hunger is in relation to maybe these other things, and then if they feel hunger as a whole has improved in our state, is about the same, or has gotten worse. So again, we get some of those general perceptions, and in those cases, we'll read kind of that scaled list so they can respond, and it's an easy way to measure. We also have some standard questions around government involvement and impact. So we'll ask, do you think hunger is an issue where the government is doing too much about the right amount or too little? And we'll get that type of information. Or we'll ask around if they support or oppose budget cuts that would take money away from hunger programs, things like that, it would impact them. Or if someone strongly favored programs to end hunger, would you be more likely to vote for them?
If you all can hear me, we can't hear you.
Or how do you collect that?
So it wouldn't be quite that open-ended because everything we gather, we want to be able to kind of consolidate those responses.
I think you all have 2 mics on or something because there's a lot of feedback going on.
But we would do it in the way that I just said, where if we were trying to figure out their definition of hunger, we might have some examples and find out if they agree or disagree with that statement. Or I'm going to read 2 statements. Which one do you feel is more convincing or more accurate? Things like that. So it's an easy way for us to actually understand which one is testing better than the other.
I apologize to everybody for all the technical difficulties. We do seem to all be back online. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, so like I was saying, we don't have some of those targeted topics defined yet. I threw a few up here that we have been talking about, retesting food stamps versus SNAP, looking at testing around the minimum benefit, particularly for older adults, as we know that's usually $15 a month. We've tested around the amount per meal, like $1.38. We've tested around average benefit. We've also asked people what they think the average benefit is, or how much they think people are getting per meal. Usually those are 3-4 times reality. So, we've also talked about, obviously there's a lot around the chilling effect, around immigration. Is there a way that we can test for that? And as I mentioned, the focus on rural perception. So I'm gonna quickly take you through some of the results from our 2016 poll, just so that you can see some of this baseline that we're working with. So when we ask voters about their top issues, historically, the economy, education, and healthcare have always been at the top. In 2016, traffic and roads jumped in there, which had previously been fairly low. Marijuana came in 4th. I think that's just because it had recently been legalized. So, and affordable housing actually jumped in our other polls. It was usually around 7%, now it's 14%. So I think that this is one thing we can look at in terms of how we can partner with other areas, other issues, if we want to, in terms of getting our message out and talking about the way hunger and food relate with all of these other things that people are truly concerned about. And I know we've already had that conversation, particularly around education and schools and economy. So in terms of people's perceptions of who is struggling, that has improved since our 2010 poll. People seem to be more aware within their community and their state. But the Western Slope, more than 50% felt that their neighborhood and those around them were struggling to get by and make ends meet. So there is definitely a need there and a great awareness in the Western Slope.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Was this an open-ended, or did you give them options?
This was open-ended.
Okay, so did hunger come up?
Hunger rarely gets mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah. So across time, it has been mentioned on occasion. There are multiple issues beyond these kind of top 6 that come up, and hunger usually is not one that is vocalized. Yeah. But we did have some really positive results. There was strong support for addressing hunger, increasing benefits, strengthening food pantries. So as I'm going to move forward, I'll just show you some of the key stats that talk about that. You can go ahead one. So it was an important issue across all voters, 62%. And I am giving you guys kind of the political breakdown there just so you can see. We don't always have that out there, but there is strong support. And according to our polling company, if you have anything that is 50% or up, that's like hitting it out of the ballpark. So when we see such strong numbers, we know that it truly is an important issue to voters in Colorado. Go to the next one. And then also that there was also very strong support around not cutting programs that address hunger to balance the budget. So there was, essentially 2 in 3 voters said that they didn't want this to happen, and I think it was 48% actually fell in the strongly opposed cutting programs to balance the budget. So that was really positive to see as well. As far as how it impacts people's votes, we did see that those who prioritize addressing hunger, that people were more likely to vote for the candidate who was doing that. This was similar to our other polls. Usually we see greater than 50% support for those who are prioritizing addressing hunger. All right. This is actually a really big result, you can see, because there's such strong numbers when we polled around using taxpayer dollars to increase efficiency and effectiveness. So when we talk about investing in better technology or better tracking systems, reducing red tape, finding increased efficiencies, our support for that is kind of like through the roof, in my opinion. We only had 14% of all respondents be opposed to this. So, like pretty much 80% approval across the board, which is really good. But I think it really does come down to they want to know that where their money's going is being effective. So, yeah.
If we go back one, like sometimes when I see, can you go back one?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry,
go
you
back
can't do
one. Yeah, there we go.
Sometimes when I see language in political advertisements that talks about increasing efficiency and effectiveness, like it's very, it could go either way, and you don't know what it means, and it depends on the perspective of like the political action committee, maybe who's paying for the ad. How did people interpret that?
I mean, we did, so it is true, sometimes that phrasing can definitely go both ways. I'd have to look back at the exact question of kind of how it was all asked, but essentially a lot of the phrasing where I talked about like some of our exact words were using taxpayer dollars to invest in better technology, better tracking systems. We talked about reducing red tape. So those were the things that we used when we asked about the efficiency and effectiveness. Yeah. Okay. And then we also saw great support for government and private entities working together. So we would ask people 2 statements, which one do you agree with more? One talked about that collaboration, one talked about the solution being in private community-based organizations like food pantries and churches, and only 38% saw that those private groups were the best solution. So they really are, we've got majority of voters agreeing that it's a partnership working together to address hunger.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Quick question, you may not know the answer to this, but of the 38% who saw private groups like food pantries and churches, how did that play out political party affiliation-wise?
I do think it was more conservative and people who attended church at least once a week. So we do have some demographic breakdowns that we do in terms of marital status, their employment, their ethnicity and racial background, their income, the frequency of attending faith communities, and so and their age, all that standard stuff. So when we're done with the poll, we can do some cross-analysis depending on what we're interested in. And then in terms of no cuts to food assistance, the other one was around making cuts to balance the budget. This is just straight up cuts to food assistance. Again, we saw strong support. Of those that opposed, I did put the little note there, of opposing cuts. 27 believed that food stamps should be increased, and 36, one of them left where they were. So you do see that there's support for at least maintaining or increasing. Just a small percentage was really looking to reduce that benefit amount. And then when it comes to the actual benefit amount, in 2016 when we were polling, we were using the $1.38 because that was what the per meal per person average was for Colorado. And again, strong support saying that was too low. I will say in 2013, we had polled around what people thought the benefit was. And kind of the average benefit people thought people were getting per meal was about $15 to $16.
Oh, wow. Per person.
Wow. Yeah. So it's just interesting when you start asking. I will say a lot of people didn't respond at all. Like, I think majority, maybe even up to 80% just said they don't know what it is. But those who did think they knew thought it was around $15. So that's just something to know. You know, there's definitely we've been educating since then around this, but something that really stuck out to us when we did that poll.
So is $1.38, is that what it is? Or
It really is.
what
It's,
it say?
it's about $1.40. Yeah. And so what that's looking at, that's the average benefit, you know, broken down per day divided by 3. And then in terms of awareness of hunger, a lot of people said they don't know anyone who's experienced hunger. You can kind of see those. These were something where they could answer multiple times across issues. So you'll see that because it was multiple responses accepted of like personal experiences, or I know someone who experienced this, they aren't all going to tally 100% up there, but it is the way that that percentage kind of answered on that topic. So in terms of experiencing hunger, utilizing food stamps or SNAP, and visiting a food pantry, and then those who have personal experience or do know someone. So you can see those there. So again, it was interesting when you looked at those who experienced hunger or knew someone, really across all 3 of those areas, only maybe 5 to 7% said they personally had experience, but then another, you know, the remainder of 30 to 45% said, oh, but I know someone else, which obviously you can take with a grain of salt of, are they self-reporting accurately, or are they just saying, oh, I know someone, even if it's their own story, but they don't want to admit to that. But it still stands that we have anywhere from, you know, 35 to 50% of people who have some experience with someone who's faced hunger.
Did any of that include the meal programs at schools?
This one did not ask about summer or the school meal programs. So we did a lot of work around child hunger and pulling around that in our poll back in 2010. This one specifically asked about experiencing hunger in general, so they obviously could have thought of school meals and wrapped that into there. It didn't exclude it, but we didn't explicitly ask it.
But this wasn't based on any particular definition of hunger, so it's whatever they thought hunger.
Exactly, yeah. Which is really how we prefer it, because when we're putting things out, when we're talking about, people are always going to have their own perceptions and going to tie their own understanding to it. So there are some questions where we'll define explicitly what we're looking for, what we're talking about. There's other times we're talking generally because we want to find out how people are thinking about this issue as a whole, even if it's not the way we would define it.
Yeah, and I get that, but I'm thinking in general, when you say 30%, and it's just a general definition, that it's just like the accuracy of, I would love to understand exactly what the definitions are. You know, otherwise those numbers really wouldn't mean anything to me.
Which could be something that we poll on. So I mean, we do a lot of message polling where we would, like I said, we read various statements or definitions, we find out which one resonates, makes sense, which one people agree with more. And so that could be a way of defining how people are thinking about hunger, if we have varied explanations and find out which ones people feel they agree most with.
And I think, so Tawana, to that point, I think it's like, as we discuss this afterwards, maybe that's a priority that we feel we need to meet. And it could be, to Ellie's point, something that we're doing in this poll, or it could be, are there other ways to collect that too? But I think the important thing is to prioritize, maybe this is something missing right now. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, we're definitely, I mean, you can do so much, but we're always open to better ways of doing this. So, and then the last one here, just those personally affected by hardship, where the next one there. We asked where they would turn to besides family and friends. So we want to know, what did they think of first when they needed help? And obviously food pantries came up high, churches came up high, other nonprofits, which then we allowed them to elaborate on, and then SNAP and food stamps at 49%. So you can see kind of the breakdown there. So even though it wasn't maybe first thing that came to mind, it was still brought up by almost half of the respondents. So there's what we've done. Any other questions, any other ideas? I know we've got some open time, so.
No questions? Okay, nobody has any other questions? That's fine. So thank you, Ellie, so much. I think that was extremely helpful, just learning about kind of what polling looks like, and it makes me think about some of the assumptions we make when we're creating questions, or like the questions that we've discussed. It's like, how do people think about this, and what are we assuming they know or don't know? So I think that's always interesting. What we'd like to do today, it's 10:45, so I'm thinking I want to talk a little bit about the questions that we have used to address the baseline, or to address our baseline, and then take a little break and then go into small groups. But just wanted to let you know, like, what data is in the blueprint right now from these voting polls that we've seen. So we know that a few of them that are specifically listed are the questions that Ellie talked about. 2 of 3 voters oppose efforts by the federal government to cut programs that address hunger. Another one that's listed is 5 of 8 Colorado voters consider hunger to be a very important issue. And then we know that another thing that was written is that we know voters of all stripes want stronger, smarter programs to address and eradicate hunger. They understand that working people struggle to make ends meet, and recognize that bad luck or a downturn in the economy can affect anyone. The poll also shows that Colorado voters want solutions and progress that ensure programs like SNAP are as effective as possible, perhaps because they might need to rely upon such support to weather an unforeseen storm themselves. So I know some of the things we're talking about in previous conversations is like, where are we at right now? What data do we have? And I think Ellie's presentation gave a really good overview. I think another question that's been asked is, what else are we trying to address in the blueprint that other work groups are prioritizing? And I think this is a constantly moving discussion, but what we do know is that work group 2-3 is still kind of figuring out how their work group is working. So I don't think they've done a lot of prioritization, correct? Okay. Work group 4, though, has started to identify and will have identified their priorities by the end of the month. One of the priority potentials is around SNAP. Erin, remind me the specifics.
Sure. So one of the priority potentials for work group 4 is really looking at raising the minimum benefit level. So I think that would be awesome, and
Yeah.
feasibility is not quite there, but we have to start with big ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have a number of different solutions or priorities that they have in kind of their top list. And they'll be narrowing those down to a few at their next meeting. The other thing, I think that group has had some conversations around stigma being a huge issue around access to WIC and SNAP, and have essentially parking lotted that and said, work group 1 will do that. So they haven't had any deep conversations around what that would look like in terms of messaging or public awareness, or that type of activity, because I think they're hoping that whatever work group 1 decides would help to reduce stigma around enrolling in those programs.
Awesome. Okay. And then work group 5, as you guys know, some of their priorities are around increasing utilization and enrollment in not only summer meal programs, but overall school meal programs, and then are working on the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act. And I'm not sure if there are any other priorities there at the moment.
Yeah, so they're also going to be doing the prioritization process. They are going to be reviewing data at their August meeting. So the Colorado Department of Education had a planning grant from the Colorado Health Foundation to guide an implementation grant from the Colorado Health Foundation, and they did a pretty intensive needs assessment process for that. So that data will be ready to share at the August meeting. So they're going to have a similar conversation that this group is having around, what does our baseline data look like? What is CDE kind of able to address in an implementation grant? And then what are the priority projects and or gaps that group can identify and kind of coalesce around?
So we know there could be other data sources out there that maybe we don't know about. But in level setting, this is the data from the Hunger Free poll that we know we have. And so just because of how I think our conversation is going to go, I think it would be good to take a break right now. But when we come back, I'll reframe this, but pretty much I want us to talk about what data are we missing, and that being like major themes or major areas that we've just talked about, and or what data potentially do you guys know about that we could pull into this so that we're not having to redo this, and make sure that we're all of the data that is available is pulled into this conversation so that we're not redoing work, but making sure we level set and say this is where our baseline is, and then what questions from there do we want to get more information about. So are there questions and themes that maybe we do want to add or potentially add to the Hunger Free poll this year? Obviously there are some logistics like finances and things, but you know, dreaming big, thinking about like, what are we missing? And then how could we potentially get that data? So I'll ask a few more detailed questions to get us thinking when we come back, but why don't we take like come back at 10:55, do a bio break, grab some drinks, and then we'll split into small groups. So.
The PowerPoint sent to us.
We will send it afterwards. Yeah. Does that work? Or do you want it now? Do you want it? Oh, I can send it now. That's fine. Can you send it out?
Sure.
Cool. Okay. And Peter will return in a few minutes.
Through our questions, if there's any way of partnering, I don't know if those you're working with be receptive or willing to do that in terms of they are when we are at the community, well, everyone in our community is out in the table.
I always think about it.
I know, right? Families don't even want to talk to them about benefits because they're so scared. And, you know, we're just trying to think through, like, what would be something we need to know.
I know some of the information I just put out, like yesterday about public charge.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important.
Okay.
Because we've been working on getting that information out in other groups that I'm working with, the Center for Non-Profit.
Yeah.
But, I've seen people at Kenya Clinic, Kenya Clinic.
Yeah.
I'm working with another group in Southwest Denver called Southwest Denver Coalition.
Okay.
And, there are, that community has a significant number of unemployed people. And, I think maybe that would be a really good place to start.
Okay.
They just had this month's meeting yesterday, but it's a great comparison. If you give me your contact, the other thing I wanted to tell you was, it's more than just monolingual, it's practicing the language justice model, and it's the language of heart. So even if they can go to the grocery store, to the doctor, everything, doing things like this.
You're more comfortable in your
Exactly.
language. Yeah. The monolingual thing was kind of the pushback from our pollsters. They're like, well, it's not worth it because there aren't that many monolinguals and that. And I'm like, it's your language.
Yeah, and then that's how we can get that idea to them about it's not just monolingual, it's, you know, language justice. They did that when we were at the conference.
How do we?
Yeah, and that was, you know, something that was really important, and more and more people are doing that. But yeah, I think there's this woman that's in Southwest Denver, named Rosa Garcia, and Rosa's connected to all and she is like an amazing contact. And it's because I was in that community before. But I think I go into what I need to do, it's really be great because you can see, all of the people that are there, I think we need to learn to do that.
Yeah. I don't think you hang up the phone, but yeah, we can put them in a breakout group.
Good.
So now it's kind of moving down. But I'm working with a volunteer who's a student. But I think she sent the request directly to the commission and not to me. But I think it was fine. Does that make sense? I'm just looking at it like a little Levita. And also,
And I'm working with the Latino Victoria and Marcelo organizing committee. Yeah, Marcelo, Garnet.
Yeah, let me jot these down real quick because I'll, the attic, we have a community organized to a lot of these things, so I don't know if you're involved. I would definitely.
You guys come to my office. First day, you came to that.
Great.
Donna Garnet. And they're having two really good, events coming up in Marcelo, the I did some last night. And the, others, the Latino people in Marcelo. And
Oh, you mean for the meeting or the Wi-Fi?
Colorado, and it all happens in Spanish. Her meetings all happen in Spanish.
Wi-Fi.
And Rosa has that, and she was working with Revision. In September. And Revision has groups of people that go and meet, and I'm presenting to those people there that are those other trusted leaders that go out to the community.
Okay.
Stephanie Salazar Rodriguez. And I'm with the Mile High House with him. But I'm working a lot in those communities.
And that's, I mean, we're out there too, but I think it's always been.
More partnership. Especially what's going on now. I mean, you got to have the trusted advisors in the community. And the other thing we're working on with this is the center as well. And so trying to get out that dual message, because it's actually, the whole idea is part.
Did you send it out, Andrew, or are you working on it?
I'm working on it.
Okay, awesome, sorry, I didn't mean to.
Food, it's sensitive, it's medication, it's all those things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's how I'm gonna connect them with them.
Yeah, and that's with them too. They just have moved over their lifespan. And so they're now in the Denver Indian Center. So they're gonna be doing, starting up on August 5th. And they are mostly modeling the Spanish in this group there.
That's great. Who was that group?
Family leadership. Okay.
That's what I facilitate.
Family leadership.
Look at the lab.
It's just really like, I mean, videos like Denver Water's doing it, a bunch of other like people. Yeah. Trying to get straight into the international. But this is, so good morning, like really great. Just, okay, actually, yeah.
Okay, guys.
Like, she's actually like, Denver Water, or like, it's gonna be, yeah, like shipping.
So I know sometimes we break into groups, but we have a smaller group. So can I have everyone raise your hand if you would like, so our two options are just all of us talk as one group or break up into small groups. So who wants to talk as a full group? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. Right. Who wants to talk as a small group? Okay, there we go. Great, awesome. Never mind. So that way we don't have to worry about anything. So Peter or Andrew, I'm wondering if you could bring up just like a a note slide so that we can start brainstorming. I think there are a few questions that we're trying to answer here, and I think the major questions right now are, the big questions we're trying to answer are, what are we trying to change, and what audience are we addressing? And I'm hoping, and I would love your guys' feedback on this, but in order to get there, I think we need to gather a bit more data in the first place. And what we'd like to do today is really figure out, like, what are those next steps in order to gather that data and in order to figure out, you know, where we want to go with those next steps. So I'm thinking, you know, some conversation has already been had, but I would love to hear from you guys after seeing Ellie's poll. What questions are you asking about? Like, what data is missing? What information do you want to know that will help us decide on our priorities? I feel like from Tawana, you want to know a better definition of like how people actually perceive hunger, but I'd love to hear more from you about like what that would look like, because I think that's a big question that I have as well, but I think there's a lot to that.
Well, and then also maybe we should define what we perceive hunger. I mean, what is our definition of hunger? Because for me, when you ask me, have I experienced hunger? Well, yeah, I might have been hungry for a day, for an hour, for, you know, for a week, for a month, like, you know, so what does that really mean? Is it ongoing? Are you constantly hungry, or are you, you know, you just experience hunger at one point in your life? Like, so I think that we need to be clear, because once
Like, I'm hungry right now.
Yeah. I was hungry, I'm just like, I was hungry before. So I think that we should be clear in our definition, because then that way it'll help us to determine who our audience is, who it is that we want to poll and we want to hear from.
And to kind of go a little bit further on that, to me, when I asked if you talked about the school, it's not the school lunch anymore, but school food programs, is that without those, many of these children would be going hungry. So if maybe that was on there of asking people, do you know someone who is on the free or reduced food program at school, then, my brother lives in southeastern Colorado, and it's like, before they was reduced, it was like 85% was free, and now it's all free. And so these many children in these rural communities would be going hungry on an ongoing basis, and they're really worried about them from Friday to Sunday, what happens to them. And so I think in my mind, I think that would really help people. Plus, many times when we're talking about children who are hungry, it seems to move the needle a little more, because people are looking at children who may not have any type of responsibility or blame in the fact that they're going hungry. So I think that really helps when you're looking at policy, and many people, tug at the emotions. And when we're talking about children, like we saw a movie when we were at the convening a couple weeks ago in Springs, and, there were young children on there that were talking, and a family that showed how these children have been impacted. So to me, that seems like a really good constituent or group to make sure that people understand that are experiencing this.
So Stephanie, when you're asking about this, are you trying to better understand the perceptions of people who have kids that are utilizing child nutrition programs? Are you trying to better understand, I guess, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm curious, what's your goal of asking more questions about if people are utilizing child school meals?
No, I wasn't talking about if they're utilizing, but when they're saying, do you know someone who has gone hungry?
Okay.
Maybe one of the examples could be, do you know someone who's utilizing the child nutrition program or the school lunch program? And then that high number of people that said they knew nobody, like 60%, means, oh yeah, I know. My kids talk about that they know somebody at school. So just identifying that in that way. I'm not asking, I personally know, but so just when you're doing a polling and bringing children into that fold, I think it really helps people look at things from a different perspective.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is also like, do people consider child hunger when they're thinking of hunger as a big picture? I think that's kind of one of the questions we're asking.
Do we know that?
Yeah, no, really important. What, yeah, go ahead, Leslie.
And this may have been sort of teased out, just maybe not side by side in Ellie's presentation, but what I'm curious is like the percentage of people that identified that yes, they experience hunger compared to the percentage of people that said they access food pantries, SNAP. And then with that gap, try to understand why they didn't access those services. Because I think that's what we're trying to overcome ultimately, right? Is to get more people enrolled in these programs that need it. You know, and I think what we've learned at Project Angel Heart is like, people still see food as charity, even if they have a life-threatening illness. They're like, oh no, give it to somebody that really needs it. And so they sometimes won't access services because of that perception.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in my mind is I was thinking about this church, I can't remember the name of the church in Thornton, but they used to give free dinners and then they started charging $1 for dinner. And the amount of people that accessed that services blew up because they were paying, you know, for the meal, they were contributing. So I just like often wonder if that perception holds people back, and that's really where we could make an impact, like show how SNAP dollars help somebody become more independent and successful in other ways of their life, so that, you know, it's a we're building you up type thing versus you're just taking.
No, I think that's a really good idea. And I think as we're writing this down, what I'd love us to do is think about like what data is missing, and then us to come back as a group and say, well, where could we gather this data from? So it could be from the poll, but are there other stakeholders that we know that we could do informational interviews with? Or like, for example, could you talk to that church? I'm not volunteering you, but could you talk to that church and say, what feedback did you actually get that, what were the specifics that told us that this dollar changed the perception, and how can we as a group of committee members and everyone else involved in the blueprint be more, to have more input in gathering that data. So just keeping that in mind as well. So it sounds like, Leslie, a lot around like stigma of utilizing food banks and services is definitely something that we want more information around.
And just to jump in there, so we run a WIC program out of CDPHE. We do have a lot of survey data around participants and how they feel about the program and accessing services and stuff. So I think that's something we can certainly bring to the table. I think one of the real big values with this survey from Hunger Free Colorado, and we use this sometimes at CDPHE as well, but when you do survey voters, that's a really good audience to really dig into, are these people who are going to support policy change, and what does that look like? So I think if we have some ideas about specific policies that we want to engage people on, so whether that's, you know, more support around things, whether it's putting something on the ballot and having people vote on it. If we have ideas around that, the voter survey is a really good gauge of whether we can get some of those policies to pass and make some change.
So if we're looking at like changing the SNAP benefit, is that kind of what you're thinking, or like specific policies that we may be addressing?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not familiar enough with SNAP to know who the decision makers are with that, and if like the voters would align with that. Yeah. Or it might be more of like, I don't know. Yeah. But maybe, yeah.
Real quick, I just wanted to bounce back to Stephanie's point about constituents that are involved and the youth. So our organization represents youth, and I feel like they are often a voice that's forgotten. So they won't ever be on a poll because they're under 18. So they are completely excluded from stuff like that, and they have no say in their situation. And so I don't know the best way to include them in that conversation, but I know in Montbello they represent 1/3 of the population there. Many of them experience poverty. So they are a voice that is very much the ones that are part of this conversation that we want to be a part, to have them in it. We actually work with the youth. I've been trying to get them to come with me, but I can't get them to get here because we work so much. So, you know, but that's, yeah.
I would like to add to that. I'm working with a group in Southwest Denver, another group that's called Communities That Care. And they're working, their primary goal is to reduce substance use in young people from like 13 to 24. but they are amazing, amazing group of people, and some of them are getting paid to be youth advocates or youth leaders. And so there are some that are over 18, and then there's a significant group that are high school people. But I think that including young people like that and giving them an opportunity to have their voice heard, but also to mentor them, because they will be our future leaders.
So I totally agree. And one thing I'm just thinking about as you guys are talking is maybe we create another category of like who some of our potential partners are. I mean, I think knowing what voices are at the table or are missing from this table is absolutely important, and we should talk about that. And I think whether that's something that Hunger Free wants to act on or not, I think the blueprint does have some resources that we can put to this to help fill gaps. They're not huge, but they're little, but we can help. And then thinking about like what are the partnerships that we can leverage in order to get this information. I think this whole room has a really extensive network of partners that we could utilize.
Mm-hmm. And I will add quickly, one of the other things that Hunger Free Colorado runs is the Colorado Food Resource Collaborative, where we bring together a lot of organizations on different topics. And our last meeting was actually focused on youth and having various leaders come to the table and talk about what they're doing, what they're interested in, what they're concerned about. And it was probably one of our best meetings we ever had. That Food Resource Collaborative. And we've still, I know Colorado Young Leaders will be at our office next week. We've got a lot of ways that we're still getting that youth voice, and then we're able to put that into the policy that we're developing, the programs that we want to do, changes we're making, even if they're not part of our voter poll. We understand that that is just a critical part. And so some of that even came out of that meeting are things that we could offer up from what we found in various, discussion focus groups, things like that.
Yeah, that's huge. I think the more you guys can think about groups like that and throw them out there, I think it would be great so that we can follow up and kind of collaborate that data or aggregate. Shannon, can you just turn on the mic when
Something related, but not 100% to the poll, but if we're looking at building public will, some of the other comments made me think about how public will is often shaped by people's experience with just kind of signage for SNAP or WIC, or you accept it here. And when I was working very closely with farmers markets, it's so hard for them to get an EBT machine. The USDA is not a friendly process, and the application is set up the same as it is for a retail store like King Soopers or Safeway. And given that most farmers markets are kind of community grassroots, group of people who come together. And I think if you're looking at public will building, if you can start, at the neighborhood place and make it easier to increase food access, that way you start to, again, move that public will from more of a neighborhood space, building out from there. But anyway, if that, is something. And we had reached out actually to the USDA at one point saying, why can't we update the application? But I think that goes directly to this.
Wait, what was your request for the USDA?
Well, so if you want to have a farmer's market with an EBT machine, right? And we have the double up food bucks in Colorado, but the application process is very prohibitive and has many barriers for a farm stand or farmer's market to have an EBT machine. It's the same application process as King Soopers or Sprouts. And so the questions that they ask you are not the ones they want you to answer. You answer differently than the questions that are asked. So when you go to a small neighborhood market, right, you have a group of people coming together, we accept SNAP here. I think it's another way to bring it home to, this isn't something out there, this is here. Yeah.
When we were at the convening in Colorado Springs recently, I actually sat in on this group because I am actually really on another group, but as a result of that, I decided to come to this meeting. But one of the things that was suggested in that group was when we're talking about trying to move the needle on policy, was if there's some way that the group could find out what things are at the federal level, what things are at the state level, and what things may be at the county level. So we know where we may have a little more clout to be able to move the needle. Because I think if we do something statewide versus government, U.S. government side, that makes it easier. And so that was one of the requests that the group had there, was is there some way that the blueprint could do that? And so we could have that information and know where we can put more of our resources to really making a change, because we may not be able to do it at the USDA level.
So do you mean like what policies are on the docket? Okay, yeah. And I think that is something that overall, as with different work groups, probably we could gather that information.
Yeah, for sure. I love that idea.
I'm just trying to look for your slide on the SNAP application process. I think, was there just one question that you had about if personally affected by a hardship, they would possibly turn to a food pantry? Were there any other questions besides that with regard to SNAP?
I mean, we asked a lot of questions with regard to SNAP throughout the poll. Is there something in particular you were looking for?
So at our last meeting for the marketing subcommittee meeting, and we talked about barriers, what came up was the actual application process. Is that a barrier? Because there are a lot of questions, you give out a lot of personal information, and it becomes so cumbersome and overwhelming that people say, forget it. And in the end, they filled out all this information and probably got like $70 worth of, funding, or, And so I just think adding, if you ask the question about have you received SNAP, or, or the reasons behind why you did not participate, digging a little bit further and asking about the application process. And is that a key barrier? Because some people may have gotten to the point where, yes, I want to apply. I did apply, but it was just way too much for me to do.
Yeah. So we do, outside of the voter poll, we have done a lot of focus groups and community councils and things like that to dig into just these issues, where we have people who have already identified that they've experienced hunger or have enrolled in SNAP, or maybe didn't but had the need. And then we start talking to them about what are these barriers, how do we overcome them, what would make it more helpful, what would aid you in this. So it's definitely something to consider for the poll. I'm not sure how many people we would get a positive I've enrolled in SNAP to go into those deeper questions from the voter poll, but from some of these other avenues, definitely we want to look at barriers. And anything we have, but I think probably potentially even through, I know Denver is doing one around customer service, which probably also would encompass the application. I know that they've got a council coming together too. So
that would definitely help when we talk about marketing, because if we can identify those barriers, then we can hit that up front in the marketing pieces.
Definitely.
And that was definitely discussed in the subcommittee that we were in as well at the convening. Do all of you know about the convening that was just held? The Colorado Trust.
The Colorado Trust.
Trust. They do a health equity convening, and this year the target or the priority was food insecurity. And so we broke up, Erin came and she talked to us, and then we broke up into groups. And each one of the subcommittees that were on here, people joined each of those. And so the application and barriers to that really came up significantly as well, especially when they're saying that like the peak system originally was designed supposedly to mainstream these things and access not happening. But in addition to that they're saying that people were saying that trying to get on the phone with them and being put on hold or being disconnected, people are just like, I'm done, I'm not going to do it. $15 is not worth it, especially for the seniors. And so they were talking about if there was a way to work with, to know what I was talking about earlier about policy, because maybe at the county level, we can work with the county that they were talking about having like the bat line, you could have them, like your people at Hunger Free are at Pena Clinic, and they can call and say, I have this person here, and some way work with them together, which would then alleviate them having to go either stay on the phone or go in person. And then I was told that you don't have to have an in-person interview, but then other people said that some of the counties require that you have it. And so that's why knowing what are the different policies at each of the levels, then we know how to approach that. Because I really do think if you have your people of Hunger Free at these places, but then they still have to either have an appointment at the Department of Human Services, it kind of like how how are we really helping to streamline that process? And if they're there and there's trusted people that speak their language and somehow have some connection with human services, that would help expedite that process, was one of the other recommendations they had in the group we had there.
I want to say, Peter also was at that, so thanks for coming, Peter, today. And one of the things we talked about in our group was a high need for more information to share with different industries. But I think talking about the data from that, it's like, what do different industries actually understand about hunger right now? And what data do we need to educate them on? And so not necessarily, this could be a voter thing, or it could be more of a stakeholder interview thing, but I think there needs to be more research done on, like, how do people understand the connection between the economy and hunger? How do people understand, like, the connection between education and hunger? And what, there are a lot of different industries that we could look at. Early childhood, I don't know, legal, I'm not even sure, whatever. But my point is, there are a lot of different industries that I think we need to do a little more digging into to better understand how hunger connects to them and what's gonna be the key factor. Because people in the oil industry are gonna have a different care than people who are teachers and see their kids experiencing it. So while there's a connection to all of those. So I think there's a big need for that. And I guess the question would be, like, how we gather that. And I think there's been a lot of research done already. For me, it's more of a question of, like, what's the priority, especially in Colorado. So, like, we were talking with some people from Grand County, and they were like, my council, it wasn't council members, it was something else. But they were like, they don't really care about somebody who's who's hungry. They care more about, like, the economic impact. Well, if the economic impact is going to change their view on this so that other people can get food, that's what I care about in the long run, right? So how we can get the data and do some of that, whatever it looks like, to figure out what those priorities are, I think that's some research or data that's missing right now.
Can I bounce off that? In the different sectors, could we expand to see, so in education, maybe a lot of our focus is around nutrition programs and school lunch programs, and maybe we can expand to see if there's more opportunity in those spaces and where that opportunity is. So, like, we've worked in a way to teach kids about food and hunger with consumption and waste. And so we're working inside the school and the lunchroom and stuff to do that. So I think there's other ways to expand it too, and maybe just see, like, where those spaces are.
Yeah, and I mean, even around, like, mental well-being or, like, behavior or social, how they interact with their friends. I mean, this could get really broad, but I think to your point, how can we think a little more non-traditionally about it? What other things are missing that you guys would want to know about to help us prioritize where we go next in terms of educating people? Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I was thinking about how we get to whether people understand hunger as being just not enough food, or also including not enough nutritious food. I don't know if y'all asked about that.
I think that's really good.
Yeah, I was gonna say connection between hunger and health. That's where we live, so. I think you have to be careful to turn on your mic. Oh, yeah. I'm pretty loud, but yeah, probably. I know. You know, we have to be, Sandy Stenmark and I got into a conversation about this, just not pinholing us too much in the food as medicine type arena, like broader than that. But I do think our healthcare system is starting to see food as an important component of treating chronic illnesses, as shown by more reimbursement for things like medically tailored meals. I think just at least having the awareness in this project as well is a good thing.
And then in terms of partners who might be missing, we're talking about industries. I would imagine agricultural producers might.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
Oh yeah, you got, okay, farmers markets, but yeah.
No, it's good, important. Don't. I think to your point of partnerships, as we look at some of this data that we're wondering about, I would love you guys to think about where could we gather this data from. So thinking about, you know, we've talked about the voter poll as one definite source, but are there other stakeholders? It doesn't have to be a specific company, but it could be. But like thinking about, are there certain youth groups? Are there certain neighborhood groups? Are there certain companies, certain industries, certain, I'm not even sure. I'm just trying to give you guys some ideas where we could gather this data from. Are there different avenues to that? So would it be informational interviewing? Would it be, to your point, Abigail, the CDPHE's WIC survey? Are there other surveys? Are there other, I don't know, neighborhood forums? I would just love you guys to think a little about where we could get this information from. It doesn't mean that you're volunteering yourself to do the work, but I want you to think about what that could look like.
So are you?
Healthy Kids Colorado has at least one question about hunger. Pretty sure.
Can you say that again, Peter?
Healthy Kids Colorado survey has.
Yeah,
one question
definitely.
about hunger on it, maybe two. Healthy Kids.
There's also a question in the behavioral risk factor surveillance survey that CDPHE does.
Purpose, yeah.
And are they, oh, sorry.
USDA also has a nationwide
Gathered
survey
information
about,
from their SNAP, the ones who are already.
I think I'm talking over something.
Say that again, Peter, USDA?
The household food security survey that they do, I'm not sure how often, but.
There's an annual American Community Survey question about food security.
And I think the census, were there 2 questions about,
The
about
census?
food security as well. On the census, I think there are at least 2 questions. And on the Pecan Foundation, I think you have 1 or 2 questions as well. Like within a certain mileage amount. I don't know, I'm trying to think, we just went through a lot of data sources to pull information.
Yeah, Shift may have that information, I can check. And then my other question or comment was, I'm sure that, CDHS, their SNAP office must gather a ton of information about their people that are currently enrolled. So
What do you know, John?
I don't know what the details.
Max is the expert on that.
Okay, he's not here, but that's
not here, but yeah, they do that kind of polling all the time, so.
Okay.
One other place that I'm thinking about too, so the Essentials for Childhood grant, which is just got reissued, is looking at kind of what are the social barriers to help-seeking behavior. So it's not specifically around food security, but it's around like what can we learn from other sectors that are having this exact same issue. So I think Colorado's having the same issue both in food. You were just talking about the earned income tax credit. We're one of the lowest in the country. So people are struggling to access services in general. So what can we all learn from each other, and what can we partner on to kind of move the needle?
Yeah. So what industries are you thinking of? Or I know this is more of like a broad question, but are there any that come to mind specifically?
So I think the Essentials for Childhood data that they're collecting around, you know, what are barriers to help-seeking behaviors for Coloradans? Like, why are Coloradans not seeking help? They're looking at things like social connectedness, and I think food has a role in a lot of that space, and I don't want to also take us so big that we're paralyzed. The earned income tax credit work, I think campaign stuff that's happening. I know SNAP is doing some work around SNAP outreach. Like, there's just a ton of work happening in different spaces. So let me think through all of them, but I feel like there's a lot we can learn from others.
Yeah.
Oh, you know,
Sorry, thanks.
I was just thinking, is Healthy Kids part of Colorado's children's campaign? Because they would have some information too.
Healthy Kids Colorado is run out of CDPHE, and we do it every 2 years. So
Okay.
the survey is launching again this fall. The data we have 2017 data, so it'll come out a year from now.
Okay, so then the Colorado Children's Campaign could be another resource for data.
I just wanted to know, we did a project to try to identify where the people that are eligible for the earned income tax credit but not claiming it are located in Colorado with our Shift Research Lab. And imperfect information and not quite complete, but at the same time, we were able to identify pockets throughout Colorado using income data and census tract data And I think it might be good to try to cross-reference that with maybe any data that the state has about SNAP enrollment and where they think the gaps are. And we use, obviously we use income quite a bit, so if there's some demographic information about, a profile of what that looks like for SNAP, we could cross-reference that with what we found in terms of those missing out on the EITC, because we already know there's a strong correlation, but in terms of identifying geographical areas, that could be helpful.
Well, and Hunger Free Colorado does have our staff impact reports, which is also based at the county level on income. So, low income, who would be eligible based on their income but not enrolled or potentially eligible. So it would be really interesting to cross-reference those and see kind of where they're lining up.
Yeah, sounds good.
Someone else that is doing a lot of data collection is through Denver Public Health, and their database is called CHORDS. CHORDS, yeah.
And I think they do data collection also, if it's the same, but it may be separate in partnership with DPS. And I don't know if other school districts do that as well.
I do know with DPS for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of data collection is it?
It's a lot, I think, on, I would say, holistic health of their kids. Everything from and food, one or two of the questions, I believe, but also there's suicide, sexual, holistic health of a child. Yeah, and food insecurity, I do believe, is included in that.
Okay.
Peter, we were just talking about CHORDS and the DPS data collected about.
They are also using the Healthy Kids stuff, and then they're using it to do their the CHIP, I can't remember what, the health improvement
Community
plan.
health improvement.
Community health improvement plans and the community health, the CHINA and the CHIPS. Community health needs assessment and community health improvement plans. So a lot of that data that they're using, once they get the data from the courts, a lot of that then goes to those reports that they're doing, and that's on the every 3-year basis. And they're just doing it right now, or finishing it up now.
I'm hearing that, I guess there are two questions I have that are kind of sticking in terms of, we talked earlier about some of the constituents, and I think some of these surveys are going to probably address some of the missing constituents that we're talking about in terms of youth, at least the data about youth. But I think that some of the groups we are talking about that the voter poll may miss include youth, Spanish or a single monolingual households, and rural Colorado. So I'd love to know, do we think some of these surveys and data sources address those, or are those missing sources, and are there other places that we could potentially get that from? It doesn't even have to be a survey. I'm talking like qualitative data or something like that. But I think just thinking of those ideas. Do you guys think some of these surveys, I'm not super familiar with all of these, but do you guys think some of these surveys address like the monolingual groups or not? And if so, which?
I'm trying to, I think I got the latest big document, a report from Colorado Children's Campaign emailed to me. And so I will forward it on to, for distribution, and then we can take a look at it. But it's a huge document. I mean, they do every kind of research they can on kids. So I have to look at it.
That's okay. We don't have to have all the answers. I'm just trying to put these out there in case they help us brainstorm.
And we can do some work between meetings in terms of compiling what some of the data points of this are so that we can present those at the next meeting. I don't expect everybody in this room to kind of go back and do all of that pre-work and kind of bucket it out. So we'll do some kind of data mining and.
Yeah. I mean, and just to be as you guys know, this has been a process of like us figuring out our priorities, and it's been a little bit of go forward, go back, go forward, go back. So I personally, and I know Erin and the rest of Blueprint, appreciate your patience and understanding that this is a process. And so thank you for that. So we talked about missing groups of monolingual, youth, potentially rural Coloradans. Are there other groups that we think are missing from these data sources?
So one thing I would say is just nonprofits that focus on working directly with youth.
Okay.
And having youth voices be heard qualitatively. So I know CLP, we are one of them. So Consumption Literacy Project, Struggle for Love in Montbello, Children's Farms in Action is another one. Elk, is that what you're talking about?
Elk.
Denver
Okay.
preschool program.
Oh, yeah,
And then there's like just a bunch of early childhood education programs like Head Start and Head Start.
Oh, yeah.
There's another one that works across the Denver metro area, and I gotta get the name of them. Donna worked with them just recently to come out to the farm. Apprenticeship for Peace, I think.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
They're great. Is that the right name? I said, I think, because I wanted to make sure. Like AYOE, AYOP, right? Pause.
Yeah, awesome.
Revision also.
Oh, yeah.
Who?
Revision.
Oh, yeah, Revision.
And what about organizations that are working with individuals that have disabilities?
That's a great one. Do you know, Ellie, at all, if you guys have any or individuals with disabilities, like do you collect that data at all in the voter poll or not?
Not in the voter poll. I think that we probably collect that data on our hotline when we're working with people.
Okay.
So under that category specifically, you can put a Colorado Cross Disability Coalition.
Go ahead.
Cross Disability Coalition.
There are also, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Family resource centers that are here, like Family Forward Resource Center, and now the Center for African American Health has become a resource center. But I think there are several resource centers throughout the city that provide, food banks for a lot of families that would be good resources. I mean, in addition to food bank, just a lot of resources for families, so they're connected with families on a day-to-day basis.
What about aging populations? I'm curious how much data you have from that, especially as we know, like the next generation, a lot of people are moving into retirement. I'm curious how much data we think AARP has been an untapped resource. If there are other groups though that we think we could gather data from, specifically focused on aging populations.
No, AARP has a ton of good data.
I shared with Darren earlier that the Latino Age Wave is working in Montbello with seniors.
Latino Age
Wave. And also I was thinking the federal qualified health centers.
Oh, yeah.
Senior resource center.
Yeah.
Is the point of the partner list to glean further data from, or just push information out?
I think a little bit of both, but my intention originally was, I think we're hoping to make sure that we know what data they may have or what insight they may have into these groups, but I also think potential partners to bring into this and say, how could you work with us on this as well? But not exactly possible.
You can put Doug on there. Okay. We work primarily with populations that are under-resourced.
Okay, awesome. One other thing to think about, there've been a couple of times it's come up today, is talking about the business community. So some of the work I've done in the past with like the early childhood community, we've worked with chambers of commerce, sometimes Hispanic chambers of commerce, Denver Metro, things like that. So depending, I think, on what direction some of this work goes in and how much we want to kind of tie economics to hunger, they could be a good partner. I don't know what data they have, but it might be more of like a dissemination tool than like pulling stuff out, but something to think about depending on what the topic is.
It's a really good point that they not only may have data, but may also, they probably have like qualitative and quantitative data about a lot of their groups.
I have a couple of things. One of the other ones that was missed was Children's Farms in Action, is a kids one, and they're in Montbello. And then up there, COP is actually CLP, Consumption Literacy Project. And then the other idea that I had for accessing use is just through Denver Public Schools. I know with our programming, we're heavily involved with the president of, the senior president at the school, and I know that's a really great space to engage you to speak to representatives of larger populations, and you can probably rally quite a few people. So maybe just reaching out to senior presidents. They want to be a part of stuff like this.
Another potential data source.
Yeah.
That of some counties and cities have been doing food systems assessments, looking at the entire systems, and those could be a rich source of data too. And those include a lot of qualitative data. El Paso and Garfield, I'm sure that there are others.
Yeah. I know that like Denver and Tri-County have a grant in Jefferson County, but so El Paso you said, and Garfield.
Yep.
And then are there others? I think in Aspen, is that Aspen?
Pitkin County?
Maybe.
What?
It's Pitkin County.
Pitkin, yeah. I feel like they're potentially doing some work as well. Yeah.
How much
that's
are we
and I wonder,
actually focusing on systems change in this work group, or totally clear on that?
So, yeah, I think right now, I think this is overall trying to educate. Right now, I think we're in the space where we're trying to understand how people view hunger and a lot of the things that are involved in hunger and what we actually need to change. But with that, I think the long-term changes are hopefully like policy change and overall changes of how people are involved in hunger. So that could be individual change or that could be systemic change. So what I mean by that is, how could the business community be more involved? How could healthcare systems be more involved? How do we change those? But I think that's more long-term because right now we don't know what the biggest priorities are in terms of changing and educating people about hunger. But did I say that correct? I don't know if there's a correct. Did I say that? Erin, you let me know. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important distinction and to get to the purpose of this group. And I think somebody threw it out earlier that the purpose of this group is to get more people enrolled in programs. And I think being really clear about that goal, like what is changing public and political will for what purpose? Is it to get more people enrolled in programs? Is it to get more policy change around these systems? Is it to make sure that everybody in Colorado understands that food is a human right? So I think getting a little more clarity on that kind of ultimate goal would be really helpful.
I keep thinking it would be really interesting to see the dichotomy of the percentages and the perception around hunger and access to food and solutions to hunger from the voting poll population and the community-based population, and how those stigmas kind of butt up against each other because one maybe fuels the other, or opposite. So that's one thing. And then one other thing I just wanted to add was when you were talking about farmers markets, one thing that I see up and coming that I'm a part of myself is a neighborhood co-op. And neighborhood cooperatives are popping up all over Denver, and I think they're great spaces for grassroots movements around food access. And when you were talking about the EBT, since we've just made it legal for people to sell, for all of us to sell our wares and produce and things that we grow and make, it would be really great if that could also be included with that EBT. If we're talking about it as access for farmers markets to have a simple way to get access to EBT stamps, then if there's a space that community members could also access that, and that could be a part of that, would be really cool because we can do farm stands in our yards.
I like your ambitiousness.
It's like residential sales.
Yeah.
What's that?
I'm sorry, are you referencing residential sales, kind of letting people know about that opportunity?
Yeah, but as a residential, so I have a neighborhood cooperative, and we can sell stuff. We haven't yet. We haven't explored it. Instead, we just kind of pass it around with neighbors, buy stuff. We don't have a farm stand, but I know colleagues of mine that have them, to have that access with EBT.
Sure, yeah.
If we're talking about farmers markets in general, neighborhood farmers co-op markets, that are great spaces. And that's something that I've heard bubbling around Montbello and our work there too. So, like that.
how big of a priority is it to you guys, do you think, to have, like, I guess I'm thinking about the expansion of like into rural areas and gathering that data versus the expansion into Spanish-only communities, or focusing on just the aging population? How do you think we should prioritize which we focus on? And ideally, there will be a cross of it, but I think, is there a way that you see prioritizing the gathering of data from those different groups?
Why do we have to prioritize?
Because because we're people, and I'm just thinking like in the short term versus the long term.
So I don't understand when you say priority, what kind of timeline are you talking about?
So I'm talking like with the voter poll, like, do we think it's more important to be adding a Spanish version of the survey, or to be outreaching rural populations, or to make our priority on like increasing the age range of people?
Because of limited funding?
Yeah, limited funding. And also just in terms of like, as we gather data, we'll find out what we have and don't have, but if we're missing data around specifically the Hispanic population versus the rural population versus the aging, we can't do it all at once, so we need to prioritize that. So I don't know what exactly we have right now, so that makes it a little hard to answer the question, but I also think it is important for us to figure out, like, do we think there is a bigger need to gather perceptions and information from certain populations? And we've talked about like the rural population, the Spanish monolingual population a little bit more. That's why I brought those up.
I guess for me, I'm just trying to, again, get more clear and focused on what we're trying to accomplish, which would help answer some of those questions. So if we're really trying to impact, build public will and political capital, like, what are the things that are going to have the most influence in those two specific areas? And making sure that we're asking the right people the right questions to determine that. Like, I feel like we're getting a little off track. I don't know, maybe I'm
No, I think you're right. I think the problem is right now, like, building public will is such a broad question. So I could be building public will with someone in rural, in like the east or western slope, or I could be building public will with somebody here in Denver. I could be building political will with city council members in Pitkin County. I could be here. And also, like, to say I'm building public will, there are so many things you could be, like, hunger is such a big issue. So I think what we're trying to do, and correct me, I don't have the answers, but I'm saying is figuring out, like, how do we create, like, get a little more detailed in terms of like what creates our view of where people are at right now. So how do people view SNAP? How do they view hunger? How, like, all of the things we were talking about earlier, like, which of this data is really going to tell a better story about where we're at right now?
Right. So to me, it's like we need to map that out more clearly and be more aligned with what our end goal is, and figure out then how do we, it's like, what's our strategy, then what are the things, the steps, the tactics we need to take to get to that place. But I think we need to better, maybe to your point, define what is that place.
Yeah.
So I think that would just be helpful for me to kind of frame my thinking in terms.
Yeah, and I think something for me, and one of the reasons that we wanted to bring the voter poll to the table is, like, one of the data points that's in the blueprint around Goal 1 is specifically that there is really strong public support for addressing hunger. And so when we say we're trying to build public and political will, what does that mean? So we're building off of a really strong baseline that we have a lot of public and political will already around addressing hunger. So what are we really trying to, like, kind of unpacking that question for me is like, so what's stopping people from taking action and having increased public and political will, because it's already high, but maybe people aren't prioritizing it as one of their top 5 issues in the state. So what's that knowledge gap or awareness gap or understanding of the fact that hunger exists in their communities that we're actually missing, that we want to address because I think that big broad question, when I saw that data point, I was like, to me, it's like, great,
Right.
cool,
So
we're there.
it's like,
We're not there.
Yeah, so if we already have that, how do we capitalize on that and take some action to, you know, leverage that political and public will that we already have that's there? What do we do with that?
So then we don't, so we already have the public will, right?
I mean, I wouldn't say that overall. I just think
right,
there's
yeah.
like a baseline. If people think hunger is an issue and they are strongly in support of addressing hunger in Colorado, and that's a great thing. And then how do we move them to action?
I'm wondering if knowing how they vote might be, so when they're presented with a candidate who supports, who doesn't support expanding benefits, but does support an issue that they care about more, that's why they're not voting. That's why they're voting for that candidate. I think it'd be good to know those kind of things. But maybe the issue priority already gives us a sense of that they might be prioritizing, you know, pro-life, someone being something about hunger.
We lost you on the last part, Peter. Sorry.
No, I was saying that knowing why they vote for somebody, you know, if they're presented with a vote for a politician who might be, who's maybe they're pro-life and the politician is pro-life but votes against expanding SNAP benefits, you know, that's important to know. There's issues that just completely overpower the will to address hunger.
And
there are
this
issues.
is, in my own, sorry, Peter. In my own ignorance, has there been a food policy issue on the ballot, and how has the vote gone? You know, like,
I don't know on the ballot. I feel like a lot of the time they've been more House than Senate.
Denver election, there was healthy food.
That's true, yeah.
But to my knowledge, none at the state level, we haven't had any food issues.
Yeah, on the city level, there was ordinance 302, which increased the sales tax 0.08 cents per dollar spent, I think, or per $10 spent. And all of that money went to support kids' nutrition and education programs. And they're in the process right now. It's a 10-year they're in the process of building a commission right now that will decide how those funds will be spent. So that was very supported. I don't know what the numbers were in terms of for and against, but it definitely passed.
Well, it was overwhelmingly in support. I think it was like 2/3 plus.
Yeah.
But there was no, it was clearly supported.
Yeah.
Contention.
one other thought I had is when we're looking at public will, or could we say that we're looking at it in two different contexts? Like we're looking at it from one end of people who maybe don't always access food support or food help or experience hunger and their support of it. And then you're looking at it from another angle of our community who does access it and how do they see it. And so we're actually like coming from maybe two different kinds of experiences that we're addressing stigma.
For the people who are like, I'm not gonna do it, or I don't feel like, to your point about people who are hesitant to say, I don't need it, it's not for me, and you have to build.
Right. And where the work is to help that.
I do, and you can impose that.
And then over here, you're talking more policy and voter and understanding of how to influence maybe a different perspective with a maybe totally different social campaigning.
People who need it but aren't active.
Yeah.
As well, building that.
Yeah.
Are you saying pick one or do both? I think do both.
Yeah, I think both. I would think it would be so interesting just to see the two perspectives and where they're coming from. I feel like there's a diversion there, maybe. I don't know.
I think it'll be hard to do both.
Yeah.
Just limited resources and focus and.
I think until we have like some direction from other work groups, it's going to be hard to really narrow it down. But I think a lot of this data and research will be really helpful in terms of identifying at least like where we are in terms of a lot of perception and barriers and stigma, hopefully we can gather this into something a little more digestible. And then hopefully we can also use it to identify maybe where there's a gap or where there are opportunities on the voter poll as well. And I think to your question, Kelly, I think it's just something that wasn't defined in the blueprint, and that's our opportunity to define, but it's a really hard question because it's so broad and like, how do we build public will? I don't know the answer. Like there's no like, it's a little bit different saying like we want to change perceptions of SNAP. That's at least a little more defined, right? And so I think it's our goal to say, what are we trying to change? And I think this is just the process of figuring out, well, until we know like where people are at a little bit more in some of these fields. And I think one thing that we missed a little bit today is where policymakers are at. And so that might be another area where we could potentially gain some insight. But I think there's just a lot of data and partners and outstanding research to be done. But I think it's all good information to gather. So, yeah.
Kind of my 2 cents.
I think I was just thinking more about this, even though we haven't had really food on local or municipal ballots for the most part. I see most of the change has been at the state level through the legislative avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe the ideal for this group, in my mind, is, when something is identified, and it's had like bipartisan, bicameral support for most everything that's gone through related to food, would be if we were able to identify something that's action-oriented to make a change, to actually put that building public will in a way that can be passed and ultimately implemented. But that's just kind of, I think there's a lot of support overall for food from elected officials. That's kind of been my experience and what I've seen.
Oh, sorry.
But I would just say, I would agree. I mean, we've seen great support for the free and reduced lunch program, taking away that reduced price for students so all students can get lunch. We've seen them increase the funding for the food pantries and Colorado producers. We've seen them invest in streamlining the food stamp program and the administration. So I think that there is a lot of support among our policymakers.
I was just trying to figure out for today what we were trying to get to in terms of, are we trying to add a question to the survey, the voter polls? And if so, what's the timeline? And and I think we talked about all the places there may be other data existing, but we could like overload on that. But it sounds like we're trying to get to figure out what data we need to make an informed decision about where we're going. And
well, and to your point, so I think some of this was figuring out what's missing from the voter poll that we're interested in adding and that we know is not already available. Right. So we wanted to make sure we weren't duplicating that. But also, like Ellie has said, and like we know, polls cost money, and this is put on by Hunger Free, and they have their own, priorities as well. So by us having this discussion, hopefully we can regroup and figure out like, where might there be some consensus of like, the blueprint knows this is a priority, we know this is a priority, let's add questions about this. Or they were thinking about adding questions about XYZ and we know this was a priority, so yes, let's add questions about XYZ. But I think it's a little bit like hard to say, this is a specific question we're gonna add just without knowing all the details, but I think it's a good question to ask, definitely.
And just to piggyback on that, the resources that we've provided, what are, do you have a timeline for looking at all of that data? Is that something that's going to be reviewed by our next meeting? Just understanding what the next steps are going to be after we've done all this.
A great question, and I totally agree with you. We need like a clear process. So we have a performance management consultant from the Department of Public Health and Environment who we are meeting with in 2 weeks or next week, who's going to help us really get clarity on what exactly the process of the work group is going to be to get to those strategic priorities, because I know people are ready to move, and I want to make sure we're ready to move in a way that is inclusive and collaborative, and that we're not just saying, we're going to do this. So we should be able to have data, I think, for the next meeting. And I think if we can't have data for the next meeting, we need to just probably hold the next meeting and do the meeting in September. I don't want to be at this place where we feel like we're wasting anybody's time, but I also want to get us to a place where we feel like we're moving quickly. So I think that we can do what we can do to look at kind of the data sources and then structure this out in a way that will move us further in this conversation, because I agree. I think it feels like, you know, we're kind of circling around something, and really want to make progress. So I can commit to that we'll work on that, and if we don't feel like we can have all of the data compiled that we feel like we would need, at least to make us, we're never going to have all the data compiled, right? Like that, let's just call a spade there. But if we don't have the data compiled that we feel like we can like have some really targeted questions and some really clear next steps, then we should probably push the meeting to September. But what are thoughts from this group on that?
I think, yeah, sounds good to me.
I was gonna add, you know, if we do look at all of the data and see what we have and what we don't have, I feel like back to your question about priority, it feels like then we really focus on the priority of the voices that aren't heard, you know, and just making sure that they are at that point. And then if we could say, okay, we do want to add a question to the poll, maybe for the next meeting, is what kind of questions would Hunger Free Colorado be willing to or open to adding more of next poll, that we could sort of grapple with the question then next time?
I mean, I just want to echo what Kelly was saying, though, because I think that unless we pick our goal, we're going to be looking at all of this data and not understanding what the data says.
Yeah.
And so I think because I think we can pick two directions, right? If other work groups think that the point of our group is to run a campaign to get people enrolled in WIC and SNAP, we probably have some of that data and we can probably get going on something like that. But to your point, Erin, about, you know, there is support for hunger, but what's stopping people from taking action? I think we need to define what action we want people to take, see what the data tells us about that, and then we can kind of move forward in that regard. But I think they're, again, two very different audiences with two very different things we want them to do. And I think we have to do that first. Otherwise, we're just going to be looking at all the data, and there's going to be a lot of data there, but we're not exactly sure what story the data is telling.
So, but when we say we, who is we? We as this committee, or we?
Yeah.
That's what I need to know, so that we can move forward. Who's
Totally.
we?
I think the we is this committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, just based on what you said, maybe we need to come together, or we need to make a decision. Oh, it's noon, right? I mean, right now, but.
We have 90 seconds.
Yeah, 90
So the way that
we're gonna have to meet in August.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a way that we can structure the data, which will give some clarity to what the goal might be able to be. Like I'm not planning on just coming in here with like a slide of data.
Okay.
So I think if we can, like, as we're fleshing through data and we're looking at kind of voter poll results, I think we can come up with some recommendations and kind of bucket that data out. And say, you know, here's the data that might support X strategy, here's some data that might support this other strategy, and here's some data so come up with 2 or 3 options for this group to have a discussion about, which I know is what we did last meeting too. But I think in a broader way of like, what's our ultimate goal, and what are we trying to accomplish if we can. So I think we can do some of that background work of, as we're collecting data, putting it into buckets of like, how does the data support choosing this as the ultimate goal?
Mm-hmm.
So I think after our meeting next week, we'll at least be able to outline some data and have some actionable, like, this is where we need to outreach some of you guys with partnerships and gather your help, or we can wait until we have the data. If it's more like research-based and lit reviews, that's I think a little different, and that would be more like digesting that and presenting it in a digestible manner.
Is there a timeline? Back to the point, are we thinking like maybe a year out for something that we want to produce and have out and take time collecting information from people and sifting through qualitative data and looking at something like that? Or is it something that we're thinking of, we want out before December, we want it to happen this year?
Erin, can you answer that? Sorry.
Sure. So I don't think that's a question we can answer right now. I think
Okay.
that's part of the process in
Figuring.
which we need to figure out
Yeah.
what exactly is this planning process going to look like, and we want to make sure we're not duplicating the previous meetings that you've had. I know I'm still pretty new, and we're kind of still figuring out the infrastructure components of the blueprint, so I'm pretty far behind in terms of the work component, so just putting that out there totally transparently. But I also know that there's an urgency to which we want to work. So I think it could be fast if we identify projects that we feel like are kind of lower hanging fruit, are really defined, and we're like, this is clear, like there's going to be no harm done, it's not a super high cost project, and we want to just move forward, i.e. like the SNAP outreach materials. I think it's like, we need this, right? So let's just do it. So there may be, I think there will be probably some other projects that are identified throughout this process that can be kind of lower cost and quicker, and we can kind of hit the ground running. And then there's going to be, you know, when we're talking about like building a movement in the state of Colorado around hunger as a human right, like that might take a little bit longer.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be dependent on the project. One of the things that I'm thinking through around infrastructure, and I know we're at time, but I will be very fast, is, you know, having each work group work on one project doesn't necessarily, I don't think it's going to make us the most progress in the next 5 years. And so how do we figure out the infrastructure where work groups can get to a place where they can prioritize a number of projects, because we also recognize there's not going to be one solution to achieve any one of the goals. And so how do we kind of create these, get to a prioritization process with work groups, but then create projects where people can actually do work, and we can have the right people at the table, because the right people at the table to do SNAP outreach materials is going to be different than the right people at the table to do a media campaign around food security. It's not going to be the right people to work with policymakers on getting them to advance policy. So I think having spin-off projects for those work groups, and then having the work groups potentially meet less frequently, but have those projects kind of bubble up, and then projects that bubble back down. So I think that that's the kind of longer term of getting that infrastructure built. So I am hopeful that we'll be able to make some progress on projects sooner rather than later. And some of the projects are going to be big and take longer, and some of them will be smaller and be able to be quicker.
Right on. I was kind of wondering when you said, why do we have to prioritize who we reach out to? And my immediate thought was, I wonder if we could split into groups, and for those who have our connections with the communities that we have connections with, and we work our master. And just get that information that we need to. Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Well, yeah, happy Friday. Thank you guys for so much great information, and we'll be excited to report out within the next few weeks. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.